Hi! Welcome to part 2 of my review featuring SLA Industries 2nd edition, the core rulebook. If you haven't seen part 1, please check out the link in the description below. It will take you to the playlist of the complete review so far. You may remember in part 1 that despite many trials and tribulations, things are still going in favor of SLA Industries. So we are going to continue from there, because now we are going to talk about the boom time from 200 to 299 SD or standard date. The boom time is SLA Industries' most cherished era. It was when everything was going right, a period of unrivaled prosperity for a privileged few, of course. It has a style of architecture, dress sense, and music characteristic to this time period that is elegant, luxurious, and classical. The birth of rival companies during the expansion era, the challengers to SLA, only increased during the boom time, however. As SLA grew more affluent, the greater the desire to carve out an independent corner of the marketplace grew in others. Other rivals were hiring out their accumulated combat experience as mercenaries as well, or simply assumed the roles of raiders, attacking anyone they deemed as easy targets. In 232 SD, SLA Industries' 127th Tech Support Group arrived on the water-rich resource world of Thalas. They discovered a massive hidden complex within a nearby mountain range. Inside, they found a vast array of lost alien technology. They knew they had landed on a gold mine as they moved through endless rows of mint-condition armor, each armed with fully stocked and loaded heavy rifles. Procedure dictated that they report their findings to head office. But this was the age of the entrepreneur. A new major rival company had just appeared in the world of progress. It was the beginning of Thresher Consortium. What followed were years bleeding into centuries of infighting within Thresher. Any noble efforts made in its past were dulled by endless raids and bloodshed. Nonetheless, Thresher, the band of exceedingly well-equipped raiders, endured. It was during the boom time that the world of progress truly galvanized its upper class. Many already wealthy families had invested in SLA Industries during the formation, and the return of investment increased dramatically by the year 200 SD. This resulted in the birth of the boom families. Families like Hinton, the Feo, Flint's Bryant, and Emershaw were old money, rich enough to buy whole planets and live comfortably beyond any loss, aside from the very top rulings from head office. The boom time was also the birth of the corporate sector, as the world of progress knows it today. It was the dawn of Mort's great law firms and investment banking. The boom families had the best of everything, going as far as to create the best schools and universities in the world of progress, putting their own progeny through esteemed foundations like Bucksbridge, Greenwood, and Napwell. In 279 SD, SLA Industries opened the Many Training Facility in Mulde. Many was, and still is, more a city of education rather than a singular building complex. It covers all aspects of operative and high-level employee status education. In 279 SD, Many was a 5-building interconnecting network, covering primarily the earliest forms of SLA professions. Over the centuries, it has expanded considerably to cover newer training packages and faculties dedicated to schooling cloak division and Stig Martyr agents. And what about the White Earth? The blank world that was used to entrap Brent Walker had never been given a name before. That world and its prisoner had been placed as far away as to be forgotten forever. But in 295 SD, reports began to filter through to head office, disquieting stories of a planet on the verges of the world of progress. The planet had found an orbit and had a name now: White Earth. It had become one world in a small solar system orbiting the red star, Herodotus. There were disturbing tales of creatures known as the Firstborn, the primates introduced to serve as the gaolers for the singular prisoner. But there were now stories emerging of confirmed people on White Earth, and a message spread across the backwater worlds. First they were nightmares, and then they were clay. The worst story finally reached Slayer's ears, a tale he had been dreading since the beginning of time. Talk of an entity on White Earth simply referred to as bitterness. SLA Industries had found its true enemy, and the rains came. Naga 7 Society were asked to conduct further research of White Earth, but like the Neophron before them, they feared the entity that ruled on that world, a being they could not restrain or control. By the end of the boom time, Naga 7 quietly disappeared from the world of progress. In 295 SD, SLA had finally destroyed the upper atmosphere of Mort, and the rains began to fall. They would never cease. The endless downpour marked the end of the boom times and the advent of a much darker period. The boom time had been wonderful for the super affluent, but in the 100 years of prosperity it had created an ever-increasing class divide. Most were learning to accept hard times and whatever strife lay ahead, but others were cracking under the accumulated stress and desperation of the times they were living in. Whatever wealth and prosperity was achieved during the boom time took a sharp downturn in the early years of the 4th century. Only the truly rich would remain largely unaffected by the crash of 300. It was believed that it was the collapse of Salvation Tower which caused the financial crash, but it was actually a massive rise and subsequent dip in military stocks and spending. The economic crash was felt across Mort and throughout the world of progress, particularly on industrial planets. A new oppressor power had grown in the world of progress, a company and ideology known as Brutalic. The company's beliefs were born out of the violence and bloodshed endured over the 300 years of rule under SLA Industries. They differed from Dark Knights because they were not driven to right wrongs. They instead embraced the dominant culture of brutality. Brutalic drew in employees who had craved ceaseless savagery. It was more than the creation of horrific weaponry, murder movies and combat drugs. It was treated as a religious practice. Brutalic effectively became a religion, a cult. Brutalic was a force that struck SLA at the worst possible time and prevented its typically swift recovery for many years. Industrial worlds all across SLA's reign saw loss of workforce, food shortages, and were left vulnerable. The Brutalic movement impacted these woes as countless agents of its savage ideology attacked SLA on the city streets and even on the war worlds, sending whole armies of suicidal madmen to tear down the company's rule. Brutalic's funding was coming from one of the original boom families, the House of Beckard of New Paris. Central outskirts on Mort had always been a vast region beset with unemployment, subversion and crime. The city planners chose to construct an enormous social services building in the outskirts that would work tirelessly to improve the lives of those inhabiting these slums during the Great Downturn. The building was called Salvation Tower, and it took 6 years to complete. It was the great hope of all civilians living in central outskirts, but almost as soon as work was completed on Mort's second largest building, it fell, causing one of the greatest catastrophes in SLA's history. The disaster took place on 12 November 300 SD, and whilst the fall of Salvation Tower suggests the building toppled over completely, it simply sank several building stories into the ground beneath it, destroying many of the surrounding buildings and the substations which powered the region. The result was a power blackout across the entirety of central outskirts. This event was called the Big Black. Once the Big Black lurched into being, what followed was citywide panic and rioting, as the frightened citizens of the crumbling outskirts fled towards the safety of Mort City, but were forced back into the chaos. A young SLA operative in training, by the name of Sandy Helen Piper, was so disgusted by the refusal and neglect of responsibilities by SLA that she immediately turned traitor and led a concerted attack against the makeshift wall defenses SLA had thrown up to safeguard itself. SLA Industries realized Piper and her supporters posed a substantial threat, so they decided to unleash an entirely new terror into the mounting conflict. A legion of robots were deployed at the defense wall to patrol the perimeter and eliminate potential threats and incursions posed by Piper and her allies. A man-machine arrived on the defensive line as well in November that was unlike anything the Shivers had seen before. Initially, it was known as AGF-14, a man-machine, not a machine, a man-machine that stood 20 feet tall and weighed in at around 1 ton. It had been deployed by SLA Industries for the express purpose of hunting down and destroying the leader of the Central Outskirt rebels, Sandy Helen Piper. AGF-14 functioned very differently from other machines, and most Shivers were terrified of it. The robot seemed to have a mind of its own, a mind that was vicious and feral. Its name changed swiftly. Because of its weight, the machine would frequently sink through the surface of city streets and stalk its way around the sewer system, only to burst back up through the cement and ambush its prey. From then on, it was simply known as Digger. Digger tracked Piper down within a 24-hour period, but did not kill her, as it was programmed. It did proceed to shadow her for a month, systematically starving her and denying her shelter or sustained rest. It also murdered anyone that came to her aid. Sandy Piper disappeared from the gaze of SLA Industries, but so too did their prized machine, Digger. It effectively completed the mission. Then it went rogue and journeyed deeper into the Dead City, taking up residence and ultimately ruling over what remained of the crumbling Salvation Tower. It was acknowledged within days of the fall that Central Outskirts would never recover from its catastrophe, and what began as a makeshift defense would mark the beginning of a fortified wall which would encircle the entirety of Mort City. It was the birth of what became the Sector Wall, an enormous structure whose boundary runs for 352 kilometers and took 47 years to complete. Since its conception, the Sector Wall has been policed by Shivers, with generation after generation of recruits devoting their whole careers and lives to it. By 345 SD, studies of Central Outskirts concluded that the ruins were now completely devoid of human civilization. What remained there was something else. The ones people had now taken to eating each other in order to survive. They were now simply to be classed as exactly what they had become, cannibals, with the Central Outskirts becoming known as the Cannibal Sectors. Now, SLA believed that simply creating downtown as a quick replacement for Central Outskirts would solve its civilian population issues, but it was clear that intense overcrowding was causing an increase in crime, disease, and the limited work infrastructure that meant 78% of the people living in downtown faced lifelong unemployment. Early in 354 SD, SLA Industries journeyed to the depths of downtown and began to dig. It intended to create a whole new series of habitation levels and force the populace to embrace these tightly confined subterranean tunnels and domiciles. People were quite literally bullied into lower downtown, and it wasn't just the civilians who were taking up residence in the region. There were also carrion, mort rats, and serial killers. They began stalking the concrete warrens. The Shiver units deployed to lower downtown were at half the capacity of those patrolling the higher levels, and after a time the Shivers actively avoided the depths and just left thousands of civilians abandoned there to their own devices. In the 5th century, SLA Industries began to reevaluate their company, their corporate structure, and the varying subsidiaries manufacturing products for them. Administration felt the infrastructure had become too sprawling and unmanageable, so in 400 SD, the consolidation era began, and whilst the majority of changes took place within the first decade, the consolidation process would continue until the beginning of 500 SD. Many of the minor subsidiaries creating biogenetic goods were brought under the banner of Karma, effectively making this singular division in charge of all aspects of biogenetic creations, from the Stormer projects to the clothes worn and the food that was consumed in the world of progress. The same brutal approach was implemented across all forms of manufacture, with only major companies running specific forms of production. Some companies wished to keep their identity and tore free from SLA rule. SLA in turn deemed them soft companies and classed them as subversives, enemies of the world of progress. Some SLA historians class this as the definitive period of the never-ending corporate war within the universe. SLA also redesigned their company structure, grouping the entire business into various departments. 100 years after the cannibal sectors came into existence, SLA Industries recognized the rapid evolution of the cannibals and carrion, and felt it necessary to devise and conduct research patrols of the city ruins. The Sector Rangers were founded in 407 SD, and the first recruits ventured into the Dead City just 1 year later. From the moment the Sector Rangers were introduced to the operative ranks, SLA recognized their value and the breadth of their capabilities. Quickly, it became clear that the Sector Rangers could travel only so far into the first sector. SLA Industries essentially went back to the drawing board with the Sector Ranger program, and in 421 SD, a state-of-the-art simulator and training center was opened in Vidri. Off-world reports were returning to SLA with news that many of its resource worlds were coming under constant attack from rival companies. It seemed that SLA Industries was starting to lose its grip on the world of progress, so it opted to reinstate the three-piece contract in an effort to establish itself as the ruling body in the world of progress. The three-piece contractual agreement was entitled after the three pillars of SLA Industries' ethos: progress, prospects, and prosperity. The contract appears optimistic until the planet's governments read through the plethora of stipulations within the contract, and then witness firsthand what it means to fall beneath the control of SLA. SLA Industries does not invade worlds, although the three-piece contract effectively strong-arms a new planet with clauses it cannot possibly accept. And so, Third Eye News airs Progress Control, an hourly news channel covering universal politics, current affairs, and interplanetary statuses. By showcasing a vulnerable planet on progress control, it is announcing to the world of progress that it is defenseless and ripe for the taking. SLA is fully aware of this and will utilize the looming threat of imminent invasion. If the planet's governments do not acquiesce to SLA's demands, they will exit and abandon them to certain attack by any number of rivals, who will likely be even more savage in their negotiations than SLA. Almost all planets and star systems in the world of progress were snared and defeated by SLA in such a manner. Therefore, many planets simply roll over and let SLA monopolize them. SLA Industries, ever intent on progress, looked to further advances in the development of armor, weaponry, and new studies in fusion technology. This new wave produced classic products which are still available in the present day, such as the Crackshot and Doggy Bone armor, and time-honored weapons like the KPS Mangler AS and the FEN 3030 True Shot sniper rifle. At the beginning of 582 SD, Cannibal Sector 1 was suddenly beset by 2 solid days of black rain. The majority of the denizens in the sector took cover and waited for the strange deluge to subside. But those who were struck by the downpour were plagued by horrific visions, unlike anything typically conjured by the region. By the end of the 48-hour period, the black rain ceased and relative normality returned to the sector. Shiver's reports spoke of living shadows, which were flitting about the Northwest Compact. These shades targeted all the species living in the sector, ravaging their minds and tasting their fears. They were the first reported dream entities on Mort. By late 590 SD, work had been completed on Lower Downtown. A further 12 civilian levels had been added, but problems had begun to crop up even before the new citizens entered. A large number of the workforce had fallen ill and suffered from crippling anxiety during the long period of construction. Workers had encountered extreme feelings of claustrophobia and made claims of abnormal occurrences. For example, some workers even catalogued histrionic reports of sky views from certain windows, an impossibility in such subterranean depths. Mort city planners simply put this down to overworked staff, suffering from exhaustion and hallucinations brought on by chemicals in the tunnel air. 15 years after the completion of Lower Downtown, shiver patrols had already dropped down to almost zero, and people in those recesses had begun to lose their humanity and were displaying peculiar behavior. As if this weren't alarming enough, the last shiver reports sent back to SLA from the base level of the region claimed that there were indications that there were more civilian levels appearing beneath. Only one shiver patrol ventured below base level and never returned. In 605 SD, VRTK, a well-experienced and resourceful Shakhtarian SLA operative, agreed to explore the fabled levels and returned with a detailed summary of findings. Turkey re-emerged on inner downtown base level 3 weeks later, disheveled, armor battered, and rambling incoherently. It took further 4 weeks to obtain anything of value from his frenzied account. He claimed that it was full of impossible creatures that had constructed their own version of reality, and that the place predated Lower Downtown. SLA resolved to dispatch some of its best Aethermen into the unknown levels. Downtown had always been an unruly and violent section of Mort society, but the mounting pressure of subterranean living and the influence of the deep construct beneath finally took its toll on Lower Downtown. On October 31st, 617 SD, things finally came to a head. Reports were coming through that a shiver patrol had been taken down by a violent and extremely disturbed group of individuals, numbering around 35. An hour later, a shiver precinct was ransacked by over 60 individuals. This night went down in Mort City's history as the 617 bloodbath. The crazies had no terms or demands of SLA, no motive. They'd just gone insane, and the madness was contagious. It took a further 12 hours for the sanctioned SLA ops to quell the disturbance, killing 150 civilians and forcing the survivors into the bottom 2 levels of Lower Downtown. In 630 SD, the very first of the long-forgotten conflict races returned to the world of progress, but not as vengeful enemies. The Omaja were now refugees. They reappeared in their original Val star system, having fled a decimation at the hands of the Root Dogs. SLA reluctantly welcomed them back, but forced them to serve within the labor force in the Val mineral mines. Having suffered such terrible losses in conflict space, the Omaja took to this work without question and performed their arduous task diligently. Yet as a species they were nonetheless plagued by bigotry and the constant threat of violence. Having spent so much time in the mines, the Omaja earned the cruel nickname Trenchers, and as a species that was always quick to temper, fights inevitably broke out. Back in Cannibal Sector 1, the inhabitants on both sides of the wall suffered the longest recorded period of heavy rain and storms in the region, stretching from 679 SD to late 689 SD. It was during this miserably protracted period that the Carrion and cannibals endured devastating famine. It was during the Shadow Decade that the earliest Dream Entity Masters materialized in the sector and set about enslaving and molding their own species. It was during the Media era that the citizens of the World of Progress began to see the many faces of SLA with greater clarity. However, through the lens of a television cathode ray tube, the viewers at home ate up any image, any portrayal of SLA in a positive light, and loved every good and bad minute of it. Within hours, the Media era had the unemployed masses in its thrall, and its grasp never wavered. A frightening new species appeared in Cannibal Sector 1 that didn't just threaten SLA Industries, but every other opposing species eking out an existence in the ruins. They were known as the Scabs, great hulking monstrosities overladen in scrap armor and tattered trench coats, each with its face concealed behind a gas mask. The terrible secret behind the mysterious Scabs is that they are yet another failed experiment by SLA Industries. These horrid children of Skarog, as they would also be known, could rival the Stormers, and were bent on attacking SLA directly. SLA had opted to keep much of its exploration a secret. They did not want to encourage a wave of intrepid explorers journeying into the uncharted provinces of Mort, unless they were in charge. They sent their own teams. In most cases, the research teams returned with promising findings, but typically the level of radiation still being emitted by the fission belt prevented much utilization of the findings for a few more centuries. In the meantime, military veterans were returning from the war worlds. They had fought insurmountable odds, secured innumerable victories for SLA Industries, and finally earned their homecoming. There was no fanfare, no reward for their honorable service for the company. SLA did make a tragic error in allowing these soldiers to retain their military-grade weaponry and armor as a meager way of saying thanks. So when SLA abandoned them, they turned against SLA, and they were known from then on as ex-war criminals. In 779 SD, SLA Industries saw a huge influx of young Shakhtars enlisting as operatives in the company. It was attributed to what the Shakhtarian species referred to as the Great Hunter's Moon. It was seen as highly fortuitous and a blessing from the four Shakhtarian gods of virtue. The Great Hunter's Moon encouraged many young Shakhtars to forego family life on their homeworlds and journey to Mort in search of noble causes, glory, and adventure. Most settled in Mort City and never returned home. SLA had seen credible evidence that crime and rebellion was at its lowest due to the rise in TV viewing. More channels, more television, more choices and opportunities in that entertainment form meant more loyalty to SLA and far less subversion. The masses were controlled. The era of progress was the very height of SLA Industries. This developed between 800 to 899 SD. It was 100 cycles in which many new high-end concepts would be sampled and run, although much would fall by the wayside in favor of time-honored traditions. This time would also mark the birth of a cult, which in time would go on to be SLA's greatest enemy. On October 31st, Mort's national holiday, 845 SD, the entire population tuned to Third Eye News and sat glued to their television sets to watch Cannibal Sector 1's first televised broadcast. Until that moment, the vast ruins and its terrifying inhabitants had been exclusive experience of the Sector Rangers, Wall Shivers, and the occasional SLA operative squad. Only the briefest glimpses of CS1 had been seen by the general populace, but now, finally, they would get unprecedented exploration of the region. It meant that CS1, or Cannibal Sector 1, would get a great deal more attention than it had gotten for hundreds of years. But not just from the average citizen. Company rivals like Dark Knight saw the enormous potential in such lawless desolation, and in late 845 SD, terror cells infiltrated the sector. In 847 SD, SLA Industries implemented bullet tax for the first time throughout the entire world of progress. It was introduced in an effort to drive operatives to favor melee weapons, which proved more popular for TV ratings. In the far south of CS1 is the Leon City, a once expensive and uncommonly picturesque section of central outskirts. The Leon has always been regarded as a Dark Knight hangout. By 850 SD, however, it had become apparent that Dark Knight was dominating the old city and had constructed a series of fortified outposts among the now crumbling Burgos architecture. SLA sent in operative teams, assisted by Sector Rangers, in an attempt to break up the Dark Knight power structure. But each and every time, the SLA force was destroyed or repelled. There's also Tech Trex Inc., which came into existence during the Chrome era around 880 SD, when cybernetics and more specifically robotics were popular in the world of progress. It was initially regarded as an oppressor power, but SLA Media had overestimated the company's output and power level. It specialized in small automated drones, which were used in raids and support equipment to other soft companies. TechTrex was more of a hit on television than a hit in battle. TV viewers love to watch operatives fighting scores of little drones created by the company. Unfortunately, by the 9th century, SLA had begun to eliminate some of its smaller but persistent enemies, and it was Threat Analysis who elected to wipe out the rival company, TechTrex. This decision received criticism, even from SLA operatives themselves, who saw the value and potential in such a photogenic and inoffensive company. However, many schematics and plans were never captured or recovered by SLA, so the inventions of tech dregs are still out there, potentially. In lower downtown, a human civilian by the name of Elliot Reich had spent years studying everything related to White Earth and the legends of Xi'an, and offering highly complex blood sacrifices to bitterness. It was the first time the call was answered. Elliot had been on SLA Industries' radar for many years, and the department devoted solely to the research and defense against White Earth considered Reich one of the greatest threats to the world of progress. Unseen by SLA, the first true incarnation of the Xi'an cult was germinating in downtown. The power to utilize blood magic was bestowed upon Reich in the form of the Lost Scrolls, the last vestiges of Xi'an herself and the spells she'd created. The gifting of such power would change everything, but as before, Elliot chose to be patient and quiet. In late 895 SD, Shiver patrols were reporting a spate of murders occurring throughout District 5 of inner downtown. Homicide was and is a frequent occurrence in Mort City, but the individual committing the killings was more distinctive than most, with his obscure orange helmet and garish outfit. The serial killer known as Halloween Jack was also highly proficient in combat and seemingly unstoppable. The legend of Halloween Jack grew exponentially over the subsequent years as the body count mounted and his TV ratings increased. In the present year, Halloween Jack is widely regarded as public enemy number 1. For close to a decade, Mort City saw a fad for cybernetic augmentation. People were turning away from biogenetic enhancements in favor of robotics. This gave way to many changes, which resulted in a path to the year of progress. However, problems abounded with applications and accessories built during this period, and many people suffered disabilities and crushing debt from cybernetic augmentations performed in the era. They simply couldn't afford to repair or replace their augmentations. Let's talk about the year that led to the present times. The year of progress. 900 SD was an important year for SLA Industries. It was the year of progress, celebrating 9 centuries of growth and success. It showcased new weapons and new advances in biogenetics in the form of 2 new Stormers and the Vevafon. It seemed that SLA, at the height of its power, could do no wrong. But it was at the turn of the new century that everything began to slip. Some of SLA Industries' most notorious adversaries, the Krell, Grosh, and the Mumix, all returned to the world of progress between 905 to 909 SD, with more vengeful species en route from conflict space. Third Eye News was very selective on reporting the conflict aliens invading the world of progress. From the Farouk system, the Neofron returned to the world of progress, but not to fight. They actually had some dealings with SLA Industries prior to the formation, but were wise enough to bow out once the company's deception became clear. The Neofron realized that what was happening in conflict space was soon to descend on the world of progress, and rather than leave it to its fate, the Neofron chose to risk all and return to the company who'd done so much damage then and now. LAD, first referred to as Longevity Chain, first came to the public's attention in 903 SD after the assassination of SLA contract killer Delia the Destroyer. Most everyone thought that was it for Delia, but instead of being shipped to the morgue, a Karma medic crew arrived on the scene and carted her away. The media began to talk of a revolutionary new medical procedure called LAD, which stands for Life After Death. And 7 days after Delia's supposed death, suddenly she was back on active duty. It seemed like a miracle, although aspects of Delia's personality had been somewhat altered during the process. Overnight, the LAD option was made available to all ops, at least those that had the means to buy it. However, the physical and psychological effects after using this were quite obvious. Not every species in the world of progress would join the program. Most other species, however, jumped at the chance. LAD was no singular process. It used state-of-the-art pharmaceuticals to maintain the patient at the threshold of life and death, and could also use biogenetic enhancements to repair and even improve that tissue, according to them. In the age of LAD, when an operative died, the medical team had 4 minutes to reach the operative and rush them back to the nearby karma base, so the process could begin, if the subject had enough funds, of course. Those that came back from death, thanks to this process, were highly aggressive and prone towards violence. In the meantime, SLA Industries was no longer prepared, however, to sit back and let the vast stretch of ruins quietly rot in the distance. It was time to take back the sectors. The first attempt to take back the cannibal sector was brutal, direct, and horrendously misconceived. They decided to launch the project Red Sky, in which thousands of Shiver recruits charged out into the sector's Elmer state and faced certain death. They were ill-equipped and ill-prepared for what they were about to confront. Red Sky resulted in a bloodbath, and it is widely regarded as one of the most humiliating defeats in SLA Industries history. After the disaster of Project Red Sky, with many troops left alive, still trapped in the cannibal sector and the families grieving for their dead, all looked to SLA for financial and medical support, which never came. Thousands of loyal Shivers died needlessly, owing to cost-cutting and an extremely poorly devised military campaign. The effective scapegoat for Red Sky was an SLA corporate by the name of Charles Sebastian Grady III. Grady belonged to one of the illustrious Boom families, but with a catastrophic failure on the scale of Red Sky, his inherent privilege could not save him. Charles Grady was facing a life term in Fallgate Prison, but before he could begin his sentence, he was shot dead by Errol Jester McManus, a Shiver turncoat and recent survivor of Project Red Sky. McManus had gone after Grady in his Jester paint job, switching Shiver green to black and red. It was the birth of the rebel Shiver faction, the 9th Division. By 910 SD, SLA was ready to take a second try at the cannibal sector. It would be called the Bellwood Campaign, named after the founder of the Shiver organization, Jonathan Bellwood. Bridgehead Endeavor was the first outpost to take hold in the cannibal sector, the first ground taken for the company in 600 years. A further 16 bridgeheads would be built in Cannibal Sector 1 over the next 5 years. If the Neo Front represented positive change within SLA Industries, the re-emergence of the shadowy Naga 7 was the opposite. In 911 SD, a scholarly organization who had not shown its face since the formation once again offered its services to SLA Industries. With the exception of the rather amiable Aethermen, Naga 7 is generally unpopular in the company and in regular conflict with the other important departments like Threat Analysis and Stigmartyr, where their inherent nosiness can cause considerable friction. In 911 SD, Agnes Daur, a high-ranking member of Naga 7, succeeded in getting a bill passed that would address the degradation of moral values and decency in downtown. At first, operatives and Shivers alike thought it was all a big joke, but quickly discovered that MR Division was serious. 4 years on, and Virtue squads are still patrolling inner downtown, bullying the masses under the thin veneer of public decency. The Bellwood campaign has been one of SLA's most recent successes, but there is still much work to be done in the cannibal sectors. The deployment of the lesser-known Stormer variant, the 830 Gator, is the latest addition to the program. The present duties of the Gators are to patrol the perimeter of the sector wall which encircles Mort City, killing and eating anything that attempts to breach the boundary. With there being so many hostile forces in the city ruins, this initially appeared to be an exercise in futility, but the defensive exercise has proven successful and won the support of the wall Shivers, who will try to make friends with the roving Gators by throwing them beer and sandwiches. Meanwhile, the Xi'an cult had grown in numbers and in power. Elliot Reich had studied the Lost Scrolls and by now had imparted all his wisdom to other like-minded individuals. A whole religious hierarchy had developed in downtown. In 903 SD, the denizens of White Earth began cropping up in the downtown districts. Hominids and other such horrors were being summoned into Mort, where they would indulge in acts of incredible bloodlust, terrifying Mort civilians with their fury and sheer otherness. Rake and his followers were creating simple summoning spells that any idiot could activate. The Xi'an are singular in their focus. The aim is not to worship, it is solely driven to destroy SLA Industries and anyone or anything associated with it. Let's talk about Bevaphon, the end. Heralded as a future of bioengineering, the Bevaphon from the new and up-and-coming company Doppelganger instead proved to be a misstep and something of an embarrassment for SLA Industries. Bevaphons were lauded as the solution to deal decisively with SLA's non-conflict enemies, a flexible and reactive weapon capable of mimicry and infiltration. Instead, an error-filled bioconstruct was rushed out that was over-engineered and incapable of the job it had been created for. They were finally fielded in the same niche as the Sinostormer, which was deployed at the same time, but the Bevaphons turned out to be much more expensive to maintain and psychologically unstable. The emergence of the lost conflict races has been a continually escalating threat in the world of progress. This forced SLA to take more drastic measures and, as of 909 SD, all manufactured Chagrins, the latest combat variant in the Stormer program, have been retrained and shipped to war worlds, such as Dante and Cross, to force back the invaders. Now, in the year of 915 SD, SLA Industries faces an inescapable world of change. The sins of its past have finally caught with it, culminating in the present date. Now everyone in the company will be held accountable as the conflict races raid and pillage every world in their path, and great enemies permeate every aspect of SLA society, converting and corrupting the very lowest and equally largest cross-section of the population. SLA is now forced to make its choice, to stay the course as the evil corporation which has unfairly dominated the world of progress for 900 years, facing almost certain destruction, or finally, once and for all, it must face and address its countless crimes over the centuries and work towards a better future. And this concludes this part of the review. As you can see, it's all very hectic, very chaotic and bleak. And in the next part of this review, we are going to talk about many important details and the current state of the world of progress. Well, thanks for watching this review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.